That's what Wai usually says, right, Neal?
It is. That's right.
Okay, so far so good. Hello everyone. Typically when Wai does the intro, I put my face up into the screen, so I got that out the way.
Nice.
We're back. It's the wellness policy. Episode number something. We're close to 20. I think we're close to 20, and that's an accomplishment, Neal. Neal, you have listened. You've listened to every one of these episodes, but now you're an official co-host. How exciting. Welcome back to the wellness policy, Neal.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be back for my second official co-hosting duties on the wellness policy. Of course, we should address the elephant that isn't in the room, and that's we are without the co-founder of this podcast this month, Mr. Wai Ting. We can, I think, say all is well.
All is well. No elephant in the room, but there is a newborn baby, a human baby that Wai helped bring into the world. As we've been told, we do not have to keep that kayfabe no longer. And all is well. Everyone's healthy. Everyone's happy. And we sincerely congratulate Wai and Pauline and the baby. We can congratulate the baby. I think we can do that. Yes?
I think so.
Okay. So those joining us live in Zoom, welcome. And those listening wherever you may be, at whatever time it may be, thanks for hanging with us. This is the wellness policy, and we're going to have a conversation today about psychotherapy. Neal, what do you think of psychotherapy?
Wow. Well, we are talking this month about modern psychotherapy, because I think, and this was your call, when I hear the word psychotherapy, I tend to think of Freud. I tend to think it conjures up images in the first instance of man with beard from 1920s or something like that. Or
a white man with a beard.
A white man, yeah. Or just like Fraser, that would be another pop culture therapist, although he's actually a psychiatrist. I suppose we'll get into some of these differences and similarities. So yes, that's what we're here to untangle this month, is what it is, the different forms it can take, what it's like. Jordan and I have both been clients. Jordan's a practitioner, but I've been on the other side of that equation for a couple of modalities, as they're sometimes called. We'll get into those as well, I guess. Psychotherapy, you're the psychotherapist, Jordan. So
this I am. And yet I think one of the reasons why it felt important, one, to have a conversation like this publicly, which I often do. This is the first time more formally doing it specifically for and with the pro wrestling community. But why I wanted to use the word modern or even contemporary is because I think, to your point, a lot of what we still in 2022 more culturally consider like therapy, or when we think about therapy, a lot of it is pretty antiquated, mid-century stuff, as you mentioned, Freud, and a more traditional psychoanalysis, which is a type of approach or theoretical orientation, where you're lying on a couch and you're not making eye contact with the therapist, and the therapist is like what we call this blank slate, where they're not bringing much of any of their own perspective or personality to the work or to the interaction. And a lot of people still think and associate with Freud more like the sexual type stuff, like an edible complex and things like that. And these things still exist. There are specific like professional programs for things like psychoanalysis in particular. But psychotherapy is incredibly different. There's been many different what we call waves or eras of the field and the approaches to it. And a lot of therapists now often choose some sort of a collective or integrative approach, kind of depending on their own personality, their own histories, and of course the types of clients that they're intending to serve. So all that to say, psychotherapy as a practice and a service, I believe is it's very confusing for the general public. As someone who's been intimately involved in pro wrestling, more from a marketing perspective, I'd say psychology and mental health services in general has a marketing problem. People don't know the different types of professionals that can provide it. They don't know the different options, at least here in the States, when it comes to like how insurance works or paying for it, or how to find a therapist, etc. I think there's a lot of confusion or just ignorance because we're not doing a good job of informing the public. So
that was certainly the case for me when I first tried to pursue it as a client. It was very easy for me to find a local registry. This is in a UK context, so the terminology might be slightly different, but there's a website for the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, BACP, and you can put in your postcode, zip code in the States, and you'll get people near you, and they tend to describe their approach. And I was as confused as all hell, because it's, yes, I'm a CBT, CBT primarily, with some psychodynamic, or we hear about family, marital therapy, couples therapy, creative and art therapy, integrative approaches, EMDR, which is a desensitization thing that I'm seeing a lot of. And I think you're right about some of the practitioners not doing a great job of describing in layman's terms, and because a lot of the people looking at this site will be looking at it for the very first time and exploring their options, and they may not know what CBT even stands for, or what is an integrative approach, what is a psychodynamic approach, etc. So, is there an easier umbrella way to describe what psychotherapy is, Jordan? The process, or does that depend?
Sure, but again, I don't think there's one or two or three agreed upon cohesive answers, let's say, because psychotherapy, I mean, look, we're using psychological approaches to helping someone improve their well-being. Now, that can be just intrapersonally, meaning just that person within themselves, as far as their thinking and their functioning and whatnot. It can be more social, as far as relationships, or helping people, navigate things like families or career, etc. In general, and especially if we're using insurance, psychotherapy often, and as we're maybe going to distinguish it from, let's say, counseling or coaching, when we're talking about psychotherapy, typically we're talking about some sort of mental diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis of some kind, especially if insurance is involved. They're going to want that, just like, seeing any medical provider. But psychotherapy can be much more than that. Often when I'm working with clients, their assumption is that psychotherapy is kind of like, you got your baseline and then you're like in a hole for some reason. So maybe there's emotional stuff going on. Maybe there's behavioral stuff going on, cognitive stuff, whatever. And all these things obviously influence one another, as we can describe in more detail later. But a lot of people have this idea of, well, I'm kind of in this hole. I want to get back to baseline. So psychotherapy may be a good fit for me. But baselines are relative. So, I ended up, I've seen various mental health professionals for most of my life, quite frankly. But as an adult in my late 20s, I went to someone. I did not use insurance. And this guy was a bit, and we can describe these terms later, but he was a bit more psychodynamic in his approach. So it was a longer term therapy of depth. It wasn't so much like, here is our specific treatment goal and then in the next couple months, hopefully we meet it, and then goodbye, see you later. And I ended up doing that service for 7 years, really up until the pandemic. And to the point I was making about baselines, they're relative. So yeah, maybe if you feel like you're stuck in a hole and you want to get to a baseline, but like baselines can elevate, and our expectations of health and well-being and intimacy and prosperity and joy and all these things, there's no limit to any of these things that I just mentioned. And I found that psychotherapy could be one of many treatments or services that could help us experience more of these things more broadly. So, but yes, in general, with psychotherapy, we're using psychological techniques, and with often many decades of evidence-based research now. That's a whole nother debate we could get into around whether like a medication model, or even like you mentioned, CBT, that's kind of marketed as the gold standard. But a lot of times when you're researching things, and I'm not outright discrediting any of these things, but usually when you're researching something, well, it's how much money is going toward what you're researching, and how much do you want to be correct in your assumption about some of these things. I can say that in general, there's all kinds of modalities, and a more general consensus is that a lot of them, if not most of them, have about equal effectiveness. Really, the key ingredient that distinguishes successful therapy from not is the subjective quality of the therapeutic relationship, or sometimes we call it the therapeutic alliance. So the rapport. What is the relationship between the therapist and the client, or the patient? Again, another thing. People are like, I don't know, am I a client or am I a patient? It depends on your preference, and it depends on the clinician's preference of what they choose to, the language that they choose. I've always preferred, at least for myself, and when I'm relating to the people I work with, I call them clients, and that feels good enough for me.
Yeah.
But really, that's the key thing. It's because it's a really unique type of relationship, Neal. Some people may be like, oh, I've got some problems, and so, but I have good friends, so I'll just talk about it with them. Or I have really supportive parents, or I have a really insightful spouse, so I'll chat with them about it. Or I'll just mention these things to my general practitioner. And all those things are very helpful. And if you have great relationships that are trusting, et cetera, with people like that in your life, then like you're blessed. But that is not psychotherapy. Psychotherapy and the relationship, a psychotherapeutic relationship, is something completely different unto itself, where clinicians are trained, not only in more formal education, but out in the field, receiving thousands of hours sometimes of supervised work before even getting a license to practice independently, in which it can be very friendly, but we're not your friends in the context of the work that we're doing. But we're someone that, and that's an advantage for the client, because this is someone that ideally the client can feel most comfortable sharing whatever it is, like literally whatever it is. And there's, at least in the States, we have HIPAA laws to protect privacy and things like this. Really, the only times that someone like me would be required to break that trust of anonymity would be if someone is letting me know that it's pretty likely they're going to be of harm to themselves or someone else. But really, beyond that, this is a place where hopefully we can feel permission to share and have someone be witness to some of our most deeply held thoughts and beliefs and experiences, and the expectation is that we will not be judged, that we will be supported, And ultimately we will be heard, and we will have a trusted advisor that can help us process these experiences for ourselves, and to help make sense of it for ourselves. So I guess maybe to kind of wrap that up, it's the therapeutic relationship. That's the key ingredient. So, we could get into a bit more detail about like how to find a therapist. And I know someone had asked, like, is it appropriate or not to, like, quote unquote, shop around or try different therapists, and what to expect in a first session or an initial consultation and things like that. And that's really one of the key things. It's like, how does it feel to be with this person?
Yeah.
Does it feel like this is someone that I could vibe with and potentially develop a level of trust with, so I can over time become more vulnerable? Because really, when we're sharing our truth, or being vulnerable or things like that, we're not doing it for the therapist. The therapist is there to help facilitate it and to help us not be alone in it. But like, we're doing it for ourselves, just like if someone is lying in therapy, it's, why lie for my sake? I mean, you're really just lying to yourself. But again, if that happens, I ain't going to judge you for it. My job is to help understand why that made sense for you to do that. And then maybe we can work to find a more productive way based on what that client is desiring, as it relates to growth and well-being.
And it's a terrific explanation. And a lot of what you said has chimed with me and my own experiences for seeking psychotherapy and what my experience is with it. So maybe I could go down that road for a moment or two.
Please.
And I would say around 2015 or so something like 7 years ago, I found myself becoming anxious all the time. And at first I thought, I'm not really sure what this is about, but it's odd, it's strange. Eventually, it became rather intrusive on day-to-day life, in respect of in the workplace, not wanting to be around people, taking time off just to avoid like being with people, and being a bit of a shut-in from even some of my closer friends. So there was,
and if I could pause you,
please.
If I could pause you briefly, Neal, when we're deciding as practitioners whether someone fits the criteria for some sort of mental health diagnosis, that's one of the key ingredients. Are these symptoms or presentations having a significant impact in one's daily functioning?
Yeah. And for me, it was impinging on work as well as in relationships that were very important to me. So clearly that would fit the bill. So eventually I made an appointment with my starting point was the general practitioner, because family doctor. I didn't know who else to start with, really. And first line was, here are some SSRIs. That is sort of first line medication therapy there that you might be expected to be given. There's tons of them, but I believe they all work on serotonin or various things.
Yeah. The SS, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is essentially an antidepressant.
Yes, exactly.
We're mostly familiar with it.
My experience with that was, having tried 2 of them, they got all of the side effects, some of them very undesirable, and none of the benefits whatsoever, even having given it 4 weeks, 6 weeks to work, and was placed on then a waiting list. The system's slightly different in the UK and in Ireland, where we don't use medical insurance as much as in the US. It does exist, but it's much less used. We have sort of single payer system, as they call it in the US, or socialized medicine, if you want to call it that. But one of the downsides to the NHS is getting treatment. Getting psychological treatment on the NHS takes a long time, unless you're presenting with something very serious. in which case probably a consultant psychiatrist is going to be getting involved in that case, to manage the case, manage specialist medication, all of those things. Talking therapies, which is really what we're discussing today, you go onto quite a long waiting list, and it's almost always a short course of CBT. And that was my way in to psychotherapy in 2015.
And for those wondering, and we'll go into a bit more detail a bit later, but CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes, cognitive behavioral therapy. And my experience of that, I don't want to get into the life story here, so I'll try to abbreviate it, but there were 9 sessions offered on the NHS. In other words, I didn't have to pay anything. Roughly across 9 weeks. There were a couple of holiday breaks in there, but once a week, no more than once a week. And my experience of this approach was it was useful in trying to understand and perhaps label processes and things that are going on in the mind and in emotions and what triggers things. And being able to say, okay, this is an example of black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking. That is an example of catastrophization, where you're getting a delivery of, this is a real example, by the way, in my case, an oil delivery coming to deliver heating oil to the house. The truck is going to crash into the wall. That's kind of a belief, an irrational, like this is going to happen belief. So you're able to learn a bit about, I think, how thinking works and how cognitions, thoughts, can impact on emotions. But my ultimate feeling from going through CBT was it was more like a night class in learning about how things are happening, rather than getting to root causes, really addressing some of the stuff in my past, perhaps, that was really relevant. The practitioner was very good at what he was doing. He certainly listened to what I had to say about my experiences, but the approach was rather standardized, rather manualized. This is what we do in session 1, and by 9, we're done. So there are certain steps in between. So to cut a long story short, I found it slightly less than helpful for my own circumstances. I know that it can be wonderful for other people, but CBT was not an approach that really, really worked for me. And by the end of 9 sessions, I felt a little better, but that I had scratched the surface and no more than that. So my next step, which I'll maybe leave for the moment, was to then pursue something a little deeper that would take longer. And yes, that I would have to pay for myself.
Yeah. And as maybe like assumed or revealed as we continue to chat, perhaps as a theme within this field and services, like who's going to pay for it? And that's a big factor in determining who you could work with and what type of treatment and treatment length that you could expect. Mm-hmm. Insurance companies in general, they may want you to feel better, but they don't want you to like have to spend a lot of time and resources in doing so. At the end of the day, it's a business, and their intent is to make money each quarter. So maybe this is a good opportunity, Neal, to just kind of share some of the more broadly applied approaches to therapy. And also, you had mentioned when your general practitioner suggested starting with medication, mm-hmm. Which again, and we'll reference this or at least put this in the show notes. None of this conversation is advice. It's certainly this is our own experiences and opinions. For me, albeit professional, but this is purely for informational purposes. But of course, speak with your own mental health care or medical professionals for consultation if you're interested in exploring these things. starting out right with medication, that's a red flag to me. Because look, there are side effects. There are real physical and emotional and behavioral potential side effects to medications. So at least for me, and I'm someone also, and I can share a bit more about my personal history with mental health care in a bit, but I'm someone who has taken different SSRIs and an SNRI, which focuses not just on serotonin, but another neurochemical called norepinephrine, I believe. And at least from my experience, yeah, maybe I felt a bit less anxious or depressed, but it kind of like took away a lot of the good stuff too. Where it's kind of like, sometimes, chemotherapy may get the cancer, but it's going to get other stuff in there too. So everyone is different, of course, as we talked about on last month's episode, like prednisone, a steroid for my post-COVID symptoms, like that fucked me up. Yeah. And plenty of other people take it and they have minimal to no side effects. But point being, when we're dealing with these powerful chemicals, drugs, it's who knows how it will work. And kind of to each their own. And sometimes it takes a lot of experimentation to kind of figure out what might be the best fit. At least for me, if I'm trying to navigate my own mental health care or talking with a loved one, I'd probably say if you got access to psychotherapy, talk therapy, or another type of therapy, maybe try that first before the drugs. If things are really, really bad, then maybe these drugs can maybe help get you to like a point of stabilization, like which often happens when people are hospitalized. And maybe once you get a bit more stabilized, then maybe these other treatments, you might be, in a better position to really make the most of something like psychotherapy, which to me would more generally be a more sustainable approach. But again, I also want to say this and put out there, if you are someone that is using these drugs, as I have at various times throughout my life, if you're someone that is committed to taking it long term, no judgment at all coming from me. Because I realize like life is fucking hard, for all of us, like we all have our own sets of struggles and fears and worries and hurdles, on top of the fact that we're all going to die at some point. Like life is very hard. So I don't want to judge whatever way someone is trying to cope with the conditions of their experience, as long as they're not hurting any others in their own ways of coping, then like no judgment from me.
And again, this is purely from my own layman's experience, but what I've observed and from other people I've spoken to who've been through similar situations, I think it does again come down to money or lack thereof in the National Health Service, where people who have who are in dire need of an operation, that's kind of priority one for where the money goes. Someone who presents with this should not be the case in my opinion, but someone who presents with depression or anxiety, a mixture of both, or some other psychological condition, the antidepressants is a very much a first line method for GPs on this side of the Atlantic. It's extremely common. They're one of the most commonly prescribed medications, SSRIs, because they're generic. They're cheap these days. A lot of them have lost their patents. They're generic, therefore cheap to prescribe. And I even remember my GPs telling me at the time, he's retired since, so hopefully he's not listening, but well, it won't do you any harm. And I'm afraid experience of it,
really?
Yeah, that's what he told me. My experience was it didn't do me any good, but it did do me a little bit of harm in the sense of it. I felt somewhat emotionally blunted, less creative. There was just some unwanted psychological and physical, I'll be blunt, some sexual effects as well that are very unwanted and very common with these. You can look it up with SSRI. So I'm perfectly open about all of that. They weren't for me, didn't work for me, but that's not to say they don't work for, they don't work full stop. Of course, they may work very well for some people.
And to be clear, I'm not anti-SSRI or other medications, but it's more like do your own research and ask questions. And that goes for anything. Look, I mean, with the stuff with COVID, I've met with different doctors, and like I come prepared with certain questions because I realize these are just human beings. Whether you're a general practitioner, an MD, whether you're someone like me, a licensed clinical professional counselor, or you're a lawyer, or you own and run a wrestling company. Like, we're just human beings. So none of us are perfect. In fact, all of us are far from perfect. And hopefully all of us professionally are doing our best to keep up to date with science and research and trends and things like that. But that's not always the case. So, it's maybe not, it's easier to just put all of your trust and faith in the professional. But we all have our own responsibility as we try to navigate these things for ourselves as well. With that in mind, what I was working to, Neal, was you mentioned that, perhaps if you're getting on this SSRI, then a psychiatrist may be a good next step. So I think it might be helpful to kind of lay out some of or share some of the more common mental health professions or practitioners, the titles and roles that they have, and oftentimes the overlap, because many people like myself can practice and provide psychotherapy, even if we have different degrees and licenses. Oftentimes psychiatrist is used as like a general catch-all term because it's been around, I believe, the longest. And that's kind of it. Often in culture or entertainment and things like this, like that's kind of who we portray as the mental health professional, the psychiatrist. So in general, these days, first of all, psychiatry, like it's a medical degree. So these are people with MDs. So they're going to medical school. They are going far longer than someone like I, who has a master's level degree. So a psychiatrist, in general, we often think of them as these are the people that can and will prescribe medication. Now, there are other mental health practitioners that may get advanced certification, that may have access or the ability to prescribe these things. There's also nurse practitioners, which is a growing field as far as going to them for mental health medication management. But psychiatrists also are trained and can provide psychotherapy. I think these days you see less and less of that. Why, you ask? Well, it takes a lot more time and you're not getting paid as much. You can meet with someone for a bit of time and figure out a diagnosis and prescribe them some medication. And then like every couple of months, you can meet with them for 15 minutes just to re-up the medication instead of committing every single week for 50-ish minutes doing talk therapy, where insurance companies might be reimbursing far less than suggesting pills or prescribing medication. But I know psychiatrists that really prefer to provide psychotherapy. And so I want people to know that that is an option as well if you're looking for someone to provide that type of talk therapy service. Then we got psychologists, and psychologists have a doctorate degree, and again, this is in the States. In Northern Ireland or Canada, I don't know what you guys are doing, and I didn't put the effort to research this.
So far, exactly the same. Yeah, I know a psychiatrist who was a former politician, of all things. Spoke to him very briefly earlier this week, just to give me some pointers on what it is you do and your colleagues. And he does virtually no talking therapy at all. He's much more involved with severe, maybe that's a little pejorative, with more serious psychoses and things like that, inpatients in a psychiatric hospital that he works in. He and to the best of my knowledge, his colleagues do very little in the way of talking therapy.
Yeah, so then we got the psychiatrist, then we got the psychologist. So that's a doctorate degree. At least in the States, there's a couple different types of doctorate degrees where you are still considered to be a psychologist. There's the traditional PhD. And if you're going that route, then chances are part of your training has more of a thesis route, where you're going to do a bit more research and probably have to defend a dissertation in order to receive that degree. We also have a PsyD route, so a doctorate of psychology as opposed to a doctorate of philosophy. So the PsyD route, that is if you're more interested in a clinical career. So you're not getting as much training in the research side of things, but more if you want to be a professional that is well equipped to do psychological testing and diagnosing and treatment and so on. And then beyond that, we'll get to what I am. So in the state of Maryland, and again, in the US, a lot of this is state related. So in the state of Maryland, I have a license called an LCPC. So licensed clinical professional counselor. In other states, it's just called an LPC. But catch-all term, professional counselors. And in order to get that license, I needed a master's degree in counseling psychology. In my program, I did a clinical track as well. So I got a lot more training in the psychological assessment and the testing and things like that. But also I needed certain classes in counseling in particular in order to apply to get this licensure in the state. There are also social workers. So often you'll see, someone who has an MSW, a Master in Social Work, and oftentimes their license is a LCSW, at least in Maryland, a licensed clinical social worker. So whether you're an LCSW, whether you're like me with the LCPC, or if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist, all of us can provide the service of psychotherapy. Okay, all of us have training in psychotherapy, and in order to get our license, especially the clinical license, we had to do internships and many hours. I believe for me it was like 1,500 face-to-face client hours supervised. Not meaning that the supervisor's in the room with us, but that we have a dedicated supervisor, and that's someone that we regularly check in with to kind of process the work that we're doing out in the field. So all that to say, a lot of people can provide the service. Now, beyond that, there's a whole field of music therapy. For me, for those that don't know, a lot of what I do, not so much today because I've gone pretty much virtual in the clinical work that I'm doing, but from 2014 to 2020, and even in the internships prior to 2014, most of what I was doing was using drums and percussion instruments. But as people, are promoting me on their websites about the services, or, I often, speak with media and things like that, I always have to be mindful of letting them know I'm not a music therapist. And what I'm providing as a service is not music therapy, because music therapy is its own field, which means you'd have to get your own degree in that and your own license to practice that. So what I do is, I can call it therapeutic drumming. I can call it therapeutic. Really, anyone can use the word therapeutic followed by anything, and that's not necessarily unlawful. But I'm someone who uses a musical modality, but as a licensed clinical professional counselor, if that makes sense. And then there's art therapists, there's marriage and family therapists, there's equine therapists, using horses as part of the approach. So as you can see, there's all kinds of different, not only approaches, but approaches that we can legitimately claim to be a form of therapy. Yeah, please.
Again, that mirrors very much what the situation is here. A licensed practitioner of psychotherapy, as opposed to the other professions that you mentioned of psychiatry and clinical psychologist, will generally have at least a bachelor's degree in psychology, but sometimes nursing, sometimes social work, sometimes one of the caring professions, as they call them, and then very extensive training and to get credentialed, sometimes taking up to 4 years or so. That's from my own research and speaking to my former therapist as well, to see what was the route that she went down in order to get the letters after her name. And it's a bit like here too. There are you've got to do your own research to a degree, in the sense that people will have a collection of letters after their names that may not mean an awful lot to you. Over here, it's BACP, which is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. The IACP, which is the Irish Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. And of course, we can, there could be either in somewhere like Northern Ireland or the south of Ireland. There's the UK Council for Psychotherapy. There are various professional bodies that can credential somebody, but in all cases, they will have had to go through very rigorous, the sort of thing that you've described. I don't know how many 100 hours of with clients or whatever. And I'm curious, Jordan, how long after your master's it took for you to, how long in a time span, rather than how many hours of practicing or of practice it took for you to say, right, I'm licensed.
So we have a thing called a graduate license, which is kind of like driving like a learner's permit, essentially, where you can practice, but you have to have a supervisor. And so, I got a decent amount of my face-to-face contact hours in the few internships I did, where I was paying the university to essentially go out and provide these services. And then I got the graduate license, and then from memory, I believe in total I needed 1,500 hours, including the hours that I got in the internships. And then there was also a minimum time commitment. I believe maybe 2 years. I could be wrong, but I think it's 2 years. So it took me at least that to get the full license, where if I chose, I could practice independently. As a professional, like I've always worked as a part of a small private practice. So I've and the internships were more in school systems. So I've never really worked in like hospital settings or things like that. Really, much of the work I also had done was in what we call adult day programs. So these are adults that typically don't and can't live by themselves. If they're lucky, they have family to live with. Most live in group homes. And for a lot of these people, this is just their day-to-day existence, coming to these centers for 6 days a week for 6+ hours a day. And that's where primarily I was going in. I was doing my drum circles as a legitimate group therapy, which these people and the facilities very much appreciated, because these people often don't have productive, healthy opportunities to feel connected in community and to be individually expressive in big ways without being told like stop it or be quiet or calm down. So yeah, I mean, look, and we got a handful of questions throughout the Discord and whatnot, and maybe this is a decent time. I believe Aram is his name. He said, so he asked, is psychotherapy considered a legit education in the States that you can enter at a school, or is it a private education like here? And for context, after asking, he said he was raised in Denmark, but now lives in Sweden. And he goes on to say, my coworker is currently studying it, but since the government doesn't acknowledge it, he has to pay for it. Every other education doesn't require a fee, but this one does. Psychotherapy is what we're talking about. And he can't really understand why. I don't know why. I asked for a bit more clarification about kind of the question, and in response, I got, wait, what? Like, no, higher education isn't free in the States?
Yeah, that's right.
And like, kind of, yeah. Um, uh, as of now, it's a state by state thing. There are states that offer perhaps some more, like community college, maybe at like reduced rates. Certainly, state schools are more of a reduced rate, but still in the many, thousands, if not tens of thousands, to get a bachelor's degree. There's scholarships and things like that, but like in general, in the U.S., you're paying for this shit, and it's not cheap. And at least the path that I took, I didn't just get the education. I needed to get the master's degree. But with the master's degree, I can't do psychotherapy. I need a state license, which meant that I needed to find a place to work while also getting supervision, on top of studying for a national counselor's exam, on top of taking a state law test. All these things cost money, on top of, background check type things, application fees. So like, it's a very expensive field to just enter and to hope to make a decent living at it. And much like teaching professionals in this country, many mental health professionals, I would argue, are severely underpaid based on the value that they provide, and certainly underfunded as well, more broadly in our country.
And again, so, Jordan, same story on this side of the Atlantic. Tuition used to be free at university. People got a grant from the government to go and basically study anything. It wasn't just for what they tended to value more highly, like a doctor or nursing degree, right through all the humanities, whatever. In the 90s, they moved to a model of student loans for your tuition. So you don't have to pay up front, but you do have to pay at the end. The interest is low, and you have to reach a certain salary before you need to start paying it back. But you do have to pay it back. It's a deferred loan. So yes, higher education in the UK is also costs you money. In the end, at least, you're not expected at the age of 18 or 19 to stump up in advance. You'll get a loan, but afterwards, your student loan needs to be repaid. But psychology and related subjects are absolutely seen as completely valid, and they'll attract a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or whatever.
And to be honest, I understand or have empathy for someone who's a psychiatrist, let's say, and spent maybe 10 years in higher education. Has hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans. They're finally getting their first job where they're making some money in their late 20s or early 30s, perhaps. I could see where you want to take the route that you can make the most money the quickest and the easiest. Because at least in this country, like, student loans are pretty unforgivable. This current administration are kind of nickel and diming forgiveness, but historically, more recently in this country, you can't avoid that, and interest will only continue to compound each year. So in the interest of time, because I know we still have a few questions from people that submitted them prior. There's some people hanging out in Zoom that I'd imagine may want to hop on and either ask a question or share their experience. So if you're one of those people, hang tight. We'd love to hear from you. But I do want to do a very quick overview of just these different types of approaches or modalities or theoretical orientations, we call them, because we mentioned some of them already. So more traditionally, you got the psychoanalysis, and in many ways that kind of evolved into what we call a psychodynamic approach. I use an oftentimes psychodynamic approach in the work that I do. And the therapist that I worked with for 7 years as an adult, which to be honest, the best investment I've ever made in myself. It was expensive as fuck, relatively, and for me, By the end, I was paying a couple $100 every single week. But it still was the most valuable investment I've ever made in myself, because it completely transformed who I am and the ways in which I engage with myself and the ways in which I engage with others in relationships, professionally, and otherwise. I'm a fundamentally different person. I'm a fundamentally different person for the better because of my investment in the psychotherapy that I engaged with for years. So when we're talking about like a psychodynamic approach, it's more of a relational approach. So Neal, you mentioned with the CBT, it was 9 sessions. It felt very manualized, and maybe it felt like your practitioner was kind of just following a script. So yes. I'm sure at a minimum, all therapists are going to lead with kindness and perhaps empathy and not be judgmental, etc. To develop rapport. But like, we also expect that from our accountant. And we also expect that from someone doing customer service at a retail store, ideally. Sure. So a relational approach is much more than that. With more of a relational approach, it's the relationship between the client and the therapist. Like, therein lies a lot of the work. Because the ways in which a client will engage with us or relate to us oftentimes helps us develop insight into how they may or may not relate to others in their life. And so by focusing on what's happening dynamically in the room or in the session, there is a lot of focus on that. That leads me to, in the Discord, MCS had mentioned, I feel at times I'm wasting my therapist's time or not getting hard action items. Maybe she feels I need to talk and not be given tasks. Discuss. So I followed up a little bit just to be clear, and he, she, or they clarified, talking more about feeling like they're wasting the therapist's time. And also indicates there's no outward indication that I actually am. But apparently there's some belief or thinking going on, thinking I'm wasting my therapist's time. And with a relational approach, what I would suggest is like, say that. Like, tell your therapist, hey, I'm not sure what's going on, if this is like, if you're noticing this or anything, but like, I'm having this feeling that I'm wasting your time in the session. And although that for a lot of people, that can be really scary, because for a lot of people, to be vulnerable in general, or to perhaps say something that they think the other person may not agree with or like, for some people that can be really challenging, and in some cases threatening, depending on the interpersonal relationships they've kind of been used to growing up, or currently. But if you're going to be honest, like 100 honest with anyone, then I'd hope it's a psychotherapist, because that's what we're trained to do, and to not make you feel judged, or to invalidate your own experience, but to be able to say, hey, I feel like I may be wasting your time. If one of my clients told me that, I'm going to lean into it and want to get closer to them, meaning I want to help understand their experience more. Yeah. And we can, work on it together. So it's very collaborative in that sense. Also with a dynamic approach, we often call it a therapy of depth. So we're looking into the past and we're looking at formative relationships. And it's not entirely present or future focused, but we're kind of looking at like, where did this develop? Or why does this make sense? For some, maybe a coping mechanism when someone was 13 years old really, really worked for them, for whatever the reasons were. But maybe as a 33-year-old, they're still doing it, often unconsciously, and it's not helpful anymore. So with a dynamic approach, we're also kind of looking more at things of origin, looking backwards to make sense of what's happening in the present, with the intent to make things better moving forward.
Absolutely. And I can attest to that, because As I mentioned earlier on, after getting mixed results, to put it kindly, from CBT, that's the route that I then took, was a practitioner who took a very largely a psychodynamic approach, integrative, but very largely psychodynamic. And I can share a few things about that. But I see Scrump has his hand up, and I wonder whether he might have to get back to work at PWT. So should we ask?
Yeah, let's
Scrump?
do that. And then we'll continue on with these different kind of schools of therapy.
Please unmute yourself, Scrump.
Oh, hello.
Bang, bang.
Hey,
What's
Berto.
up, Scrump?
Hey, how's it going, guys? Sorry, I joined in a little late. I am at work right now. But I definitely wanted to jump in on this one in particular, as therapy is something that last few months it's been new to me. I do need to give a huge shout out to Jordan, as he helped with that process. The last 5 months have been pretty rough for me. And in a time of desperation, like, I reached out to Jordan because I knew, what he does for work, and like therapy with me, like my mom's gone to therapy, so it wasn't something foreign. I know specifically for like Hispanic males, it's one of those like, therapy, just go drink a beer, or I don't know, some like weird macho shit like that. Thankfully, wasn't ever a thing with my family, as like, when my mom started doing therapy, she like openly talked to my sister and I, like, if it's ever, something you guys want to do, like, don't feel weird, don't be ashamed or anything like that. So when I felt the need to, I reached out to Jordan, and, the resources he gave me were so valuable in me finding like a good therapist, because it can be daunting, like for someone who's never done it before, it can be something that's very daunting, and I didn't necessarily know what to expect, aside from just kind of like general things that Jordan has said to me, and these last, again, 3 months in particular were especially rough. But the one thing that sort of helped keep me like on an even keel was being able to be open and honest with my therapist. That when you guys breach that subject, because a lot of times, it was without getting too into it, it was sort of my own doing. I put myself in my situation that I currently was in, and was sort of just, I made the bed and I was now sleeping in it. And there was a lot of things that I did that it felt embarrassing to talk about, more so shame. And so these were things that I could come to, friends and family. But I always felt very much like everyone's going to hate me, everyone's going to judge me. But like in talking about it with my therapist, I learned a lot of it was like, your own sort of personal insecurities and these ideas that we project onto like other people. And now, like, not that I was ever like sort of apprehensive about, being as open and honest as I should be, but like, it is definitely a lot easier now, because again, like I sort of feel it's like, well, I'm paying you for your time and service. And like, we're both wasting our time if I'm sort of trying to control my narrative and just, make up this story that didn't happen, And I think for anyone that's listening either now or, at a later time, like, definitely, if the best advice, that I could give is, if you think something's going to make you sound like a terrible person or make you sound dumb or whatever thing you have in your head, it's tell it to them, because I would say 90% of the time, it is just, again, us projecting our own, thoughts, fears, insecurities, whatever it is, like, onto ourselves, because, it's just never really the case. Sorry, they're practicing for the air and water show. If you guys hear the fighter jets in the background.
Are you okay?
But yes, I mean, and as far as, like being open and honest, I definitely think that's something that if you are in therapy, you should explore.
Very much so, Scrub. That really rings a bell with me. And maybe we went in to our respective therapists for different reasons. But one of the greatest lessons that I learned was being honest and open with yourself, with that. The therapist helps you to be open and honest about what's going on with yourself and therefore with everyone else. And I feel a better person for the whole process. Like Jordan was saying earlier on about, it's made him into a fundamentally different and better person. I feel that very much as well about my experience with it. So it's tremendous to hear that you've had a good experience so far.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Scrum.
Oh, no, I was saying, I mean, in like with Neal, like in particular with you, like it's like you were thankful, Jordan as well. There's a handful of people, specifically within like the POST family and things like that were like reaching out, hey, how are you? And it's, again, it's sometimes it's difficult to sort of just like nothing positive this week again. It's sort of this like continuous cycle of like, nope, I'm still as sad as I was last time, but thank you for checking in on me. Like you mentioned, it's like, I also like, I don't feel like I'm anywhere near done with therapy, or that I will be, for a while at least. Like it's still something, it's actually become something that, that like I look forward to, as I do feel like it is helping me, grow more as a person. There's a lot of things that I didn't necessarily, know that I did. So subconsciously, at least, it's a lot of coping mechanisms with, stress or anxiety or grief, sort of things like that it's sort of, talking about it with someone, that when they bring light to it, it's like, oh yeah, that is definitely not a healthy way of, coping with whatever grief or whatever thing that you're going through. So, I mean, much like you kind of said, like again, in the 5 months or so of having done therapy, like I definitely feel more prepared now for just anything that sort of comes my way, as opposed to before, where, I was sort of, was Chicken Little, running around that it's the end of the world,
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've had that experience thus far, Scrum. And I'm glad you reached out to me when you felt like you needed some guidance in how to help yourself. And for those listening, at least in the States, there's certain websites. I think the one I mentioned is Scrump was psychologytoday.com, but there's other similar sites, which is, it seemed like search engines essentially for mental health practitioners. And with sites like that, you can search based on your zip code, location, based on what insurances they take, to see if you could use your insurance for the offering. Obviously, like what your presentation or symptoms are, the reason why you're seeking treatment. You can kind of see different practitioners that focus more in those areas, etc. So, Scrum, is that what you used to find a good fit for you?
Yeah, it was. I believe that was the one, because it was literally as easy as, just doing that. I put in the insurance that I had and my zip code, and I was able to, it shows you, brief little bios on the therapist, what they specialize in, like price range, and again, and that is a tool that like I use in, like everyday life, because like again, like everything that I've been going through, something just that I've been open with, in as much as like, hey, I'm going through it and I'm getting help, like I'm not someone who's embarrassed to talk about going to a therapist or something. And I've actually had like a lot of coworkers who, who sort of coworkers or friends who listen to my podcast, were like, hey, what's the name of that site? Or, hey, where can I go? And like, it has become like a very useful resource that like I then pass on to people, whether or not they pursue it, like, I don't know, but it's, it is, at least to me, it's a good thing that it's a lot of like older men, like mid 20s, mid to mid 30s, that are like doing this because it's always a thing about like, oh, a lot of men don't really want to get into therapy. A lot of people, I shouldn't just generalize it, but I know, sorry again for the fighter jets. that this was a thing. Again, especially within the Hispanic community, which a lot of my coworkers and friends, that is what they are. And it's just, to me at least, I feel a little bit better that someone heard me, on a podcast talk about an hour a week has made me feel a little bit better about what's going on, and that they sort of also want to, try and better themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were open to it. I'm glad you're finding value in it, Scrum. We love you. And to go to therapy, nothing to be ashamed of. If not, I think you're a cool ass motherfucker for doing so. It's a sign of it's a sign of strength.
Very much
It's a
so.
sign of self-love and self-respect and love and respect for all the people in your life to invest in your own personal development. That stuff trickles out to everyone that you touch and everything that you do, quite frankly. So thank you, Scrum.
Breaking those stigmas that have existed for a long time, I think is so important as well. I mean, even as short a time ago as 2015, when I started going, I insisted on calling it counseling for a while instead of therapy or psychotherapy. I just felt it was a less loaded term, until I started doing the psychodynamic approach. And I said, no, I'm in therapy. That's what this is. It's a therapeutic, the words mean things, and, it's whatever. But it's tremendous to hear that Scrump is at least some way down the road and getting a lot of benefits from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to continue on, if we can, just an overview, and thank you, Scrum. Just a quick overview of these different schools of therapy. We kind of touched on psychodynamic with some level of depth, pun intended. Then you got more behavioral approaches, which at least chronologically became this second wave of therapy mid-century. And then you got cognitive and the cognitive theory, and this idea of and again, if you're kind of looking up stuff, most of us culturally, when we think of behavioral psychology, we think of Pavlov's dog, for instance, and these conditioned responses that we have. Then we have cognitive therapy or cognitive theory, where we're starting to understand as a society that, well, a lot of what's going on in our minds, the beliefs that are formed and that we hold on to, which inform the thinking, the thoughts that we have, that helps run the show. And yes, in many ways it does. It's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So this idea that our thinking impacts our behaviors. But also within CBT, we're paying and respecting a lot of our attention to emotions. So for instance, you may have an anxious thought, or you may have a depressing thought. Well, what happens when you have these thoughts or hold on to these beliefs? Well, then you're going to feel anxious, or you're going to emotionally feel depressed. And if you're emotionally feeling a certain way, well, then we can probably predict that your behaviors will be influenced by what you're feeling. And thus, we create this model of a cycle in which all of these things influence one another. So oftentimes in a CBT approach, we're focusing more on cognition and held beliefs, and kind of check to see if they're accurate, if they're helpful, if they're productive, and so on. I think what a lot of these approaches leave out is just the emotional piece of things. A lot of things to us, we can make sense of it logically, but our emotions, that is way more powerful than cognition. And we can just look at the evolution and the structure of our brain to understand why that is. The emotional centers of the brain are far more primitive and far more linked to our survival than the forebrain, or what we call the new brain, which deals more with cognition, planning and thinking and abstract thoughts and stuff like that. So Neal, you talked about experiencing a very manualized, maybe clinical type of therapeutic treatment. And I would argue that if we're not bringing more of our emotional experiences to the forefront of the work, then perhaps it may not be as powerful and or sustainable as it could be, as far as the potential of therapy, holds within it.
Sure, that was my experience, at least. I know others who've found CBT to be life changing, but for me, there were a lot of very key elements missing. Exploration of the past, which to me was crucial to make progress in the psychodynamic approach. And also, even as someone without training and without a degree in this subject, I knew that sometimes the sort of panic response, the fight or flight, the adrenaline, doesn't require a cognition. You just feel a certain sense of threat, and you're not really thinking, oh, there isn't a sort of a thought pattern that leads to it. It's almost hardwired, primitive kind of.
Yeah, you might just feel something something in your gut, or your heart's racing all of a sudden.
Yeah, and you get that cold feeling of the adrenaline beginning to flow. And CBT, for me at least, didn't offer a pathway to deal with that in the same way as longer term talking therapy did.
Yeah. And by the way, like this ideal or this model of, well, our thinking influences our feelings, which in turn influence our behaviors, and so on and so on. Like, I don't have to say I'm a strict CBT therapist to apply that type of wisdom or theory to the work that I'm doing. So a lot of these schools of thought or approaches, there's plenty of overlap as well. These aren't just like, and that's kind of the art of the field as well, which is one of the many reasons that why I was attracted to this field. I'm not that interested in the science. Now, yes, I'm interested in having evidence and practicing evidence-based approaches, absolutely. I'm just not interested in necessarily doing that research. I'm more interested in using what we know to perhaps be helpful reliably, and apply the art of actually doing that with human beings out in the world. That's what's interesting to me as someone that my whole life has identified and engaged with the world more from an artistic approach. And just very briefly, other kind of approaches, we have a whole, like a humanistic kind of school where we're thinking of, we're really bringing in these ideas of unconditional positive regard and really a non-judgmental approach, and really treating our clients or patients with kindness and respect and things like that, where more traditionally maybe therapists could be seen as more cold, or like I said, a blank slate, where they're not bringing much warmth to the interaction. We have existential approaches, so looking more at making meaning of one's life and dealing with existential, ideas like what am I doing here, and what am I going to be doing here that's worth my time here, and what happens when I die, so on and so on. We have, as I mentioned earlier, music therapy is its own field. We have more broad art therapies. We have more specific trainings and certifications and licenses if you're going to work in a family therapy model or in a couples therapy model. And I guess while we're here, it makes sense. One of the questions we got actually in the Up Next Facebook group comes from Joe. And Joe said, my wife wants us to go to couples therapy. She sees someone already. I told her I'd go, but would not want to go to her therapist. I'd like someone to treat us from the start with no background. Am I right or wrong? And there is no right or wrong to give us a sort of non-answer, but I understand where you're coming from, Joe. And I think I may feel the same way if I was in your position. I'm not a couples therapist, but to be honest, today I actually had a session where it was a couple. But I was very clear when my client asked about the potential of bringing his wife into a session with us, I was very clear that what we are doing is not couples therapy per se. I'm not trained in particular in that approach. And really, the way that I was framing the session was that it's his therapy. He's my client, and we're following his treatment plan and treatment goals, etc. But this is someone, obviously, a very significant person in his life that was dropping in for a session. And that it was very helpful, at least for me, to see, them interact and get her perspective. And then in the upcoming weeks, he and I can process and make sense of that. So I totally understand this, that you may feel that, her therapist, quote unquote, may have a bit more bias, or just has more information, or has developed a deeper connection than with you, given that you haven't met before. Go ahead, Neal.
Conversely, as somebody who, went through therapy with the same person for, every week for just over 2 years, I wouldn't want, if my therapist had also had some experience in couples therapy, I would be wanting to go to someone else and start fresh, like he mentioned. As you say, there's no right or wrong, but that would have been my thought, is that my therapist knows everything about me, and would be starting with us as a couple. Therapists are still human beings. I think that I would just fear that there'd be a bit of favoring of me in that context. Possibly not, who knows? But it would not be the road that I would have preferred if I had been in that position. And I'm the other person in this. I'm the person who's been with a therapist for a while, not the partner of someone who has. So I don't know. Take that for what it's
fair enough. And look, just say you end up dropping in with a session with your wife and her therapist, mention that and see how this therapist responds to that question. And that'll tell you a lot of information and give you information as to what is this person's approach. Have they done these things before with clients, and have they found it to be effective, etc. Maybe you end up doing like one session with your wife and you really vibe with the therapist and think the person like is a good fit for you and may be helpful, and then maybe you change your mind completely about this. So again, that may actually be a productive place to start. Maybe just one session, if everyone obviously is open to that, and then go from there. But again, there's no right or wrong. I guess, Neal, as far as these different approaches, there's many more. As I mentioned, like including pets or animals more broadly. There's more somatic styles of therapy where we're really focusing on the experience of the body. And again, you mentioned earlier with anxiety. Well, oftentimes when we experience anxiety, we all experience it physically in our own ways. And sometimes we have more access or awareness of how that presents in our body than others. Sometimes we're not as aware of the emotional stuff or the cognitive stuff, but we know that oftentimes in certain situations, like our chest tightens, or we start to hyperventilate, for instance. And so focusing more on the body is another approach to this work as well. So all that to say, there are many different approaches to this work. And a lot of it comes down to personal preference, and maybe even like trying different approaches and seeing what works. And just as importantly, what maybe doesn't work for you.
I think in one sense, I got lucky. In one sense, the CBT didn't work out very well for me. It wasn't I didn't get what I wanted from it. But it was just one session with she's a female, older person that I went to. It was the first person that I thought, well, seems to have a lot of experience, seems to specialize in what I'm into or what's happening with me, lives not that far away. Let's go. And it's very much, I think, on both, this seems to be a very normal procedure where both parties will decide after a session or two whether the clicking is happening or not. She was.
I never assume.
No.
Yeah, I never assume during a first session that, I'll say at the end, if we both decide, or if you decide that this feels like a good fit, I'll never assume that we're just going to schedule session number 2.
Yeah, and that was my experience, and I think it was after the second one, because we did get something around what you might expect from a first session. Who knows? But in mine, it was really just a very basic getting to know you, why you're here, what do you want to get out of it. By the second session, I was being asked, will you do a little exercise for me? Will you write your own obituary? And I remember at the time thinking, wow, what's this? And session 3 brought it back, and we just had a bit of a very nice and really quite funny discussion about it. And I think that therapy can be very valuable when it's not so worthy and serious and note-taking, and when there's a bit of laughter and you getting to break down those walls. And I think really that's what she was at with getting me to do that. It wasn't so much, let's look at the really morbid, well, you're going to die, what will people think? It was more, let's have a bit of fun with it. And that's how that turned out. So that was one rather weird experience in the early going of psychodynamic therapy. But yes, it also built up trust quite early on. And that's also key with making progress, in my experience, at least.
Yeah. And look, built trust with you. And that's not going to be the case for everyone. And also, don't expect an exercise like that in your first few sessions. But Neal's therapist at the time, this was something that they felt would perhaps be of value for Neal. And clearly it seemed to, the instincts were spot on for that. Yeah. There's still some more questions we got, but I see Asher's hand has been up for a while, and he's been waiting patiently. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, Asher, then we would like to say hello and welcome to the Wellness Policy.
Hello. Shalom, guys. Great to see you.
What's up, bud?
Great to see you manning the fort, holding the fort.
Thanks, Asher.
We don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it, Asher.
Something's happening.
You're doing a great job. You're doing a great job, and I'm really enjoying the thoughts from both of you about therapy and all of the things therapy. I can share a little about my past. I have experience with therapy for more than 20 years, mostly as a therapist, being not the patient. Sorry, English is not my first language.
Okay.
And also from my work as a teacher and a community organizer, working with youth. I worked with, youth at risk. Youth at risk. There is a correlation. You guys probably know more about it more than me. So I worked with a lot of people who dealt with mental health, like me or more than me. And I wanted to first say that it's a journey. And I totally agree to what you both, I want to reiterate what you both said about personal connection. I've had, I think, if I have to count, at least 7 or 8 or 9 people that I met in my life, because I'm like my age, in my age, I'm closer to Neal's age, I think. We are both
old is what he's saying, Neal.
Yeah, I'm getting that.
We both started watching Wrestling Challenge and Superstars, I think, around the same time. And so a lot of people, a lot of approaches also. It took me a very long time to find my niche, so to speak. again, I'm sorry if it's not clear. It's not my first language, but I've had like at least 5 therapists in Israel, where I'm from. And it was more like something more conservative, traditional, German. You mentioned Freud and all the logotherapy streams, the classic ones. And it was very hard for me personally to find myself in those, because I was not diagnosed then with ADD, something that I know a lot of people are familiar with and talk about. But when I was growing up in the ancient 80s, early 80s, no one really talked about those things. So I was diagnosed at like 35, mid 30s, and all the therapists I've had up to that point, which is a lot because I was already, I was working as a teacher and suffering from depression. So we're talking about like 3 or 4 people. I didn't really connect personally in a significant way with any of them. And my breakthrough was CBT, what you mentioned here, Neal.
Okay.
I had a totally different experience, but I also had much more time to learn about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was fortunate enough because there's a department in the hospital where I'm from where it was offered free with a waiting list, or I'm talking about like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, free with a wait list or with a copay in the hospital. And I did both. I loved it so much the first time that I actually wanted to do it again with with the copay to see if I can learn more about the theory. Mm-hmm. Because for me, unlike you, which is fine, theory I felt like helped me a lot with my personal work. And also with the therapist I have today, which I love and I've been with for 3 years. And I will also want to echo what Jordan said about, personal connection. And one of the things you said, Jordan, reminded me of something she says all the time, where it's my time. It's my time, and I need to feel comfortable. Not only if I want to be quiet or, say something that is personal, maybe you need to be vulnerable to say. I can even be late. I can not show up. I can be this is my time. And I want to end with thanking you guys, because the past few years have been very full of eventful, and we all share a lot. And your show and your work here with the community has also been so valuable in that aspect. And we talk about how community and people in general is a good thing for what we're talking about. And I wanted to wish you good luck on your whatever you're doing with the show.
Thank you, Asher. We're doing something, apparently, and we appreciate that you find some value in it, and that you're becoming a more regular contributor. Mm. So
one thing I'd like to perhaps just chip in is that Asher clearly has had a very positive experience with CBT, and I think that's terrific to hear. And it's really all about those sort of moments of enlightenment or moments of clarity that you can get, and however you manage to reach them, as long as you reach them, that's the thing. So I'm really, really pleased to hear that it's worked for for Asher.
Definitely. So as we start to close out, Neal, in the Discord, a very lively, enjoyable Discord. If you're not a part of it, don't know about it, postwrestling.com/Discord. You can join us there. We have a wellness policy thread or channel. I don't know what we call them in Discord, but there's all kinds. Hey, they talk about wrestling in there too.
Yeah,
apparently sometimes.
So. New Japan,
and
Jordan. New Japan wrestling.
New Japan. We'll get to the end. We'll finish with the New Japan. It's been a very exciting month or so, and culminated in an incredibly exciting day for me, and not so much one Eric Marcotte. So Snapcat in Discord had a handful of questions. Some we kind of touched on. So thank you, Snapcat, for sharing some of your questions. One, are therapists asking more, like working with a certain budget financially? And obviously, as we mentioned, one of the bigger barriers to us, more generally receiving this work, are finances. I paid a lot of money out of my pocket for the service, but I didn't want to use my insurance because I didn't want insurance to dictate what type of treatment and for how long, et cetera. Like, I didn't want their involvement in my treatment. So for me, it was just between the therapist and I. But as far as, budgeting, if you have insurance, certainly look at what your options are. Many have mental health benefits. Some don't, unfortunately. You can call the insurance company or go to the website and see what your benefits are. And also, if you just go directly on your insurance company's website, you should see at least a handful of local practitioners that are in network. So that may be helpful. Also, if you're paying out of pocket, oftentimes therapists will work with a sliding scale. So if your income isn't as high, or your expenses for whatever they may be are higher, then maybe some therapists are willing to charge you on the lower end of what they're willing to, maybe charge other clients. So that sliding scale is something that you can certainly ask about, for instance. But unfortunately, it costs money, and depending where you live in the world, it may cost more than others. But again, it's a service like any other. And the way I looked at it was, this is an investment. So maybe I can afford to invest more of my income toward weekly psychotherapy instead of, eating out at expensive restaurants all the time, or buying more shoes, or however else I may choose to spend my income.
That was how I approached it as well, Jordan. It was simply that it was how valuable is it to me? Now, I quite understand that if you can't afford it, and you can't afford it, and you might be able to dip your toe in with perhaps support groups at local community centers and things like that, where you don't have to pay. But I think that you'll probably find that, well, my experience is, I should frame it that way, was that it was some of the best money I've ever spent, and the stuff that I gave up to spend that money was, by comparison, completely pointless at that point.
And look, I'd also argue that the investment I made in my own psychotherapy helped me make more money in my career.
Mm-hmm.
Even just my whole journey of courting Ring of Honor and then negotiating with Ring of Honor, all of that, I typically brought that up and processed those experiences with my therapist, because all of those things triggered a lot of stuff within me, fears, insecurities, doubts, etc. And also, in the world of pro wrestling, a wide variety of personalities that you're engaging with, and a lot of social gymnastics, we could say. So oftentimes, having someone to share these things with, whether to get his feedback more directly if I was asking for it, or to just help to have an hour every week where I could only focus on myself and make sense of what's going on in my life. I found that to be really helpful for me. So a couple more questions that Snapcat had. Is it bad if I seek out multiple options before deciding on a therapist? No, not at all. Maybe be upfront about that, just out of respect. Don't leave a therapist like hanging. Let them know this is what you're doing, and you may or may not hear back from me, etc. But again, as we said, the number one thing that often determines success in this type of work is the connection between the therapist and the client. And why expect that any therapist that you come into contact with is going to be the best fit for you? So yeah, it's very common for people to, and many therapists may even offer a 10-minute consultation, phone call or something for free. If they do, take advantage of that. I think what I often see as far as new clients that I'm working with, a lot of them, at least in Maryland, are telling me, oh man, I'm so happy that you had availability, because people just seem to have a hard time right now just finding a therapist in network with them that is available to take on new clients. So just to put that out there, that may be a barrier to entry as well, unfortunately, if you're seeking out treatment. He also asks, or she or they, how do I know if a therapist is right for me? Go with your gut. How does it feel to be with this person? Does this feel like someone that I can be myself with? And maybe if you don't feel uncomfortable, many people feel very uncomfortable the first time because it's an intimidating thing and people aren't quite sure what to expect. And they're obviously there often for uncomfortable reasons. But maybe ask yourself, does this feel like someone that may understand me or that I may feel comfortable with over time, opening up to, being myself with? And there's no right or wrong answer to that. And then obviously just general professional, things about professionalism, do they feel respectful of my time and boundaries, or are they pushing me to go too deep too soon? Are they showing up on time? What's their communication like, maybe leading up to it, etc. So all those things might be good in finding a good fit. And finally, an interesting question, what are some common misconceptions about therapy or therapists? So as I mentioned earlier, maybe a misconception about therapy, and as Neal mentioned, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom all the time. In fact, having some levity injected, I find to be very helpful. We had that comedy episode of The Wellness Policy a few months ago, and I randomly stumbled upon a therapist on Twitter just prior to going live who leads with humor. And we invited her on to share her professional experience with us. I'm someone that I prefer that too. And I used a lot of it in my own work with a therapist, and I use it a lot as I'm working with my clients. Now, sometimes that can be a defense mechanism. So again, it depends on us being clear about that. And at least when I'm using it as a therapist, working with a client, I'm always, with anything that I do in the interaction, I'm always operating through the filter of, is this in service of the client? So if I'm using humor at a certain point, I am assuming that it is of benefit to the client. And if it isn't, or if I'm not sure, I'll check in and literally ask, because that's the point. It's how honest and direct and connected can we be to make sense of what's happening in the room. And look, I'll tell you, when I started, Neal, this journey of becoming a mental health professional, I was going through an identity crisis of my own. I had just left I rejoined a band after 2 years of not doing that. But I was trying to find myself. And I remember when I went to the orientation for the grad school program, I wore a shirt that I typically wouldn't wear, like a polo type shirt, because I felt like I'd fit in more, and like I had a dumb haircut, and like I didn't feel like I could be myself. I felt like I was trying to fit into a culture that didn't feel that irreverent or creative or fun, simply. And I let go of much of that over time. And then especially as I started working with clients and started feeling more competent and successful and secure as a clinician, that is correlated with me allowing myself to be myself and to be a bit looser, and like, and also like even publicly, like I do a lot of dumb shit publicly, quite frankly. Like I had a comedy show on Instagram. Sometimes I act like a fool here. I worked for a professional wrestling company. Like maybe years ago, I would have thought like, well, I can't do that and still be a mental health professional, because then maybe like there might be a stigma attached to that. And like, fuck all that. Because if I'm going to work with a therapist, obviously, like it goes without saying, I want them to be skilled. I want them to be ethical. I want them to be professional, obviously. But like, I also want them to be themselves, whatever that means. So the things that I've always fucked with, whether that's being weird or eccentric or artistic or engaging in music or engaging in pro wrestling, whatever that may be, the more that I've personally accepted that within myself and allowed myself to own these things, these personality traits, these interests, and so on, I think I've become a more skilled professional, whether in psychotherapy or in any of the things that I do where people give me money.
I went through a similar journey in therapy, from being what I thought a client ought to be, right. I know I need to be open and honest, or this, it won't work, so do I dive in with some of the like more serious stuff from the past, and as the journey went on and we got to know each other better, I found that I was becoming more authentically myself. And that's kind of the way it almost is in life when you meet people. And I mean, people who I don't particularly like talking about myself that much, but people who remember me from the early days of POST will know that my phone calls were typically just sort of ringing in to compliment John and Wai and how terrific they were. And while that was from the heart, it wasn't really a full accounting of who I was. And it takes time, to want to sort of come out of your shell and all of that. And that applied to me, at least with therapy as well. It took a while, but once I got there, it was, here you're going to get the real me. And if that means being a little bit more talking about my sex life or being a bit gayer or whatever it is, that's what you're going to get, because that's what you should be getting,
Well, Neal, we're glad that we got you, in all of you, whatever that may be. And assuming a year from now, if we're all still doing this, you'll be a different version of yourself, because like that's what life is. It's a constant evolution. And at least for myself, I found that through years of psychotherapy, I have come out a more honest, secure version of who I am, whatever that means. So to all in the room, we appreciate you. If you're listening, not live, we equally appreciate you. We love you, in fact. Thank you for giving us the gift of your attention. We don't take it lightly. Neal kind of lobbed it up in the air, I guess, for me to well, I guess I'm not even gonna say hit it out of the park, because Neal, I did fucking hit it out of the park. We had this post wrestling, this G1 contest of sorts. Full disclosure, when I worked with Ring of Honor, I worked at times very intimately with New Japan. Global Wars tours, War of the Worlds tours, the G1 Supercard event. So I have a deep familiarity with the company and the talent, but truthfully, I haven't really paid much attention since I left Ring of Honor in the middle of 2019. And somehow, Neal, in this coveted E-block, they called it. See, I didn't even figure out. I didn't know why they called it an E-block at the start.
Well,
that's how ignorant I am to this thing. I figured it out. But there was one winner, and not only one winner, but like one decisive winner. I think I heard Chris Zengler, I believe is his name, who spent, it seems like, a lot of time and a lot of talent facilitating.
Kudos to Chris and his very deep stats on what everyone has done in this competition. Wonderful work.
So he has helped facilitate this contest. I believe I heard him say on the show with John earlier that I may have had the largest lead in history at 6 or 7 points. So I am the E-block winner. Not only that, I finished in the top 3 amongst everyone, but we're not concerned with that, are we now? E-block is where it's at, and I am the reigning champion. We all love Randobot. She's lovely, but Randobot couldn't take it home, Neal. And to all of the other competitors, much love and respect to all of you. Someone had to win. Eric Marcotte certainly wasn't going to be the one to win this year or any year. And it feels good to be king, Neal. So that's all I got to say.
You wear the crown. You wear the crown well, Jordan. I'll give you that.
Thank you, and humbly we could add as well. Neal, anything else you'd like to say before we hop off for this month? If people want to get in touch with you, I don't know if you have like some side hustle that you're selling, like I don't know, leather boots or something. What would you like to share with the public?
Come talk to me on Discord. It's probably the best place to have a chat if you want. That's, as mentioned earlier on, postwrestling.com/Discord. If you weren't familiar with it, if you're not familiar with it, neither was I until I joined it. It's very intuitive, easy to use. There's an app for your phone, there's a website, there's an app for your computer, whatever platform you're on. And as Jordan mentioned earlier, channels for wrestling, for MMA, where you'll find Eric, and the Wellness Policy channel, of course, which is where listeners to this show will probably want to gravitate towards. You'll also find me at Neal Flanagan on Twitter. DMs are open.
Excellent, Neal. You can find me on Papa Roach on Snapchat.com. Check out Dickie Bird in the comments. We're happy for his recent updates.
Yes, very much so.
He suggests to watch Naito versus Beer City Bruiser, I believe from a Global Wars Toronto when I was with Ring of Honor. I had a huge part in bringing that to the lovely city of Toronto. You are welcome. And with that, we'll be back next month. Perhaps with Wai Ting. Daddy, we could call him now.
I always did.